The heavy rain was slowly swallowing the forest. Every drop hit the leaves and rattled the branches, leaving an echo behind as it reached the soil, merging with the decaying roots and moss-covered stones to form a silent rhythm. The fog crept slowly through the trees, this mysterious blanket, which settled on the ground with an almost palpable density, permeated the paths, rocks, and muddy mounds of earth. When the sky suddenly thundered and split in two, even the ravens hiding in the shadow of the giant trees did not stir. It was as if the forest itself was nourished only by ominousness, along with every secret it concealed. As the mixture of wet earth and humid air gave off a dizzying scent, Edward knew that the allure of this smell hid a trap. At the end of a path in a forested area of South America that was erased from maps, a path whose name no one even mentioned, a rusted sign swung. The groaning metal, with every gust of wind, whispered the weight of years and forgetfulness. San Lazaro, Psychiatric and Nervous Diseases, 1952. Time had long since swallowed this place, but some places do not vanish when forgotten. Some walls refuse to be forgotten, just like the silent screams embedded in the old building stones. Edward hung his camera around his neck and tightly clutched his backpack. He had come here for a shoot. His plan was to record the next episode of his abandoned hospital series, but deep down, he felt that the walls of this place whispered something else. Every stone, every window, and every crack seemed to carry the shadow of the past. For a week, he had been pursuing local rumors, doctors who had collectively disappeared, screams echoing at night, light seeping from windowless panes. All of it fueled the idea that madness and forgotten suffering were returning. When Edward first saw the hospital's gloomy, decayed structure, he realized that the rumors were not just urban legends, but concealed a reality. The stone walls were covered with moss, and the wind, seeping through the broken windows, howled and echoed inside like a silent scream. When he reached the door, the rusty metal surface was swollen like a crusted wound. As he stretched out his hands, he felt a cold tremor on his fingertips. At that very moment, the sky split open once more. The lightning strike behind the hospital shattered the darkness. The building shone stark white, resembling ghosts. The cracks in its walls showed the screams absorbed over the years, like silhouettes. Edward paused for a moment, holding his breath. The sound of the wind and rain suddenly ceased, as if nature was holding its breath to preserve this moment. When he opened his eyes, he was met with a strange mixture of the building's former grandeur and its abandonment. The rusty lock was still on the door, but opening it required more than just a metallic movement. Edward felt that this door was a threshold connecting the past and the present. Every step, every breath, along with the rain-washed soil of the path, brought him a little closer to the unknown, awaiting him in the depths of San Lazaro. He stood trembling amidst the trio of the forest, rain and fog. Edward repositioned his camera on his shoulder and took a deep breath. Excitement and fear were mixed within him, because he knew this was not just an abandoned building, but a labyrinth where he would confront the past itself. And within that labyrinth, the silent and deadly secrets of San Lazaro awaited him. Edward hesitated to open the door. He sighed deeply and muttered to himself, "At least I can go in and get a few shots without going too far." Edward pushed the groaning door open. Stepping inside was much harder than opening the door. When he finally convinced himself, he had proceeded to the reception. He looked around carefully. The inside of the hospital had turned into a ruin since its abandonment. Neglect had affected the paint on the walls, causing it to change from green to grey. Broken bottles, which cracked with every step, shone on the floors. After advancing a little further, he found the patient rooms on the first floor. Small bunk beds were fixed to the walls with rusted chains. But most disturbing of all was the strange tidiness inside. "Someone was here recently," Edward mumbled. The beds were not covered with dust. A few chairs were neatly arranged around the table. A novice might have thought this arrangement was the work of vengeful spirits, but Edward knew very well that abandoned places turned into a kind of playground for adventurous teenagers. Advancing deeper, he headed for the door on the left to enter one of the rooms. As he approached, he noticed Latin words written on the wall with black paint. Memoria non dormit. Memory does not sleep. Edward paused for a moment. He had never thought the Latin class he took at university would eventually be useful. The sound of a door echoing from the distant corridor startled Edward. The camera was still recording, but he did not have the courage to go in the direction of the sound. To muster his courage, he listed all the possibilities one by one. There was probably a cat inside, or a wild animal like a fox. After all, this was an abandoned hospital in the middle of the forest. Still, if he could use this gloomy atmosphere correctly, he couldn't even imagine the future view count. He turned on his flashlight and aimed it in the direction of the sound. He swept the flashlight from wall to wall, checking every empty space. He read the sign on the door at the end of the corridor. Therapy room, entry forbidden. An involuntary smile appeared on his face. Every forbidden place was the source of the horror stories. Edward took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The therapy room was scattered. It was as if someone angry had come and broken everything before leaving. There were some files on a rusty table in the middle of the room. When he turned the light to the right, an X-ray film hanging on the wall caught his eye. An outline of a human skeleton was visible on the film, but the head part was strangely darkened. Either the patient had a huge mass in their brain, or it was a faulty shot. Edward decided to use the oddity in the X-ray for his story, lifted the camera and continued recording. This is most likely where the experiments were conducted. The documents mention electroshock treatments applied to patients, but something more primitive seems to have happened here, he said, approaching the distorted X-ray to show the details. He opened the drawer of the metal filing cabinet in front of him. Inside, there was a black and white photograph. A group of doctors was smiling in the photograph. Behind them, a patient was chained to a metal stretcher, but the patient's face was blurred. No, it wasn't a lens error. It was as if the face had been scratched off the photograph itself. Edward's eyes widened. The moment he focused on the photograph and ran his finger over the dark figure, the room was enveloped in the smell of sulfur. The coldness suddenly increased. This is not a draft. He turned back with the camera. Who's there? No answer came. Only a barely audible, faint breathing sound rose from the corner of the wall near the door. It was as if someone or something was hidden in the darkness, silently following his every move. Clutching the camera tightly, he slowly approached that direction. Every step he took intensified the silence in the room. But the breathing sound paused for a moment and then echoed again, closer, more insistent. Edward froze. Whoever was standing in the corner was now behind him. He could feel the hurried breath on his ear. He had to run, right away. He looked at the door he entered. Its location had changed. The door opened to a different corridor, on a different wall. His body was trembling like a feather. He had to find the courage to take a step and get out of this hospital. The moment the breathing sound started to turn into a physical contact, he screamed and ran towards the door. Something was about to touch him. He was sure he felt it right behind him. The paths had changed. He couldn't find the ground floor, the reception. None of it. He stopped, leaning his back against the cold wall, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and brushed his hair back. Amidst his rapid breath, he heard a light, melodic child's voice. San Lazaro does not sleep. Whoever enters stays a while. Edward was on the verge of crying. In the stories his viewers feared the most, the protagonists were creepy child ghosts who laughed and sang. The scenarios he had written for years had now become real. He should have turned around and fled immediately, but there was a stranger shadow in that direction. In despair, he decided to follow the voice. The voice was coming from one of the patient rooms. When he slightly opened the door, he saw a battered doll on the floor. Its clothes were burned, and its face was melted. Its lips had formed a shape as if whispering Edward's name. Everything else was motionless. Edward. For the first time, Edward was truly scared. He was sure he had heard this voice somewhere before, but his memory couldn't focus. He had entered abandoned hospitals and shot videos countless times in the past. If ghosts were real, why had he never encountered them before? He could sense the presence of something much stranger in this place, reaching into his past. Edward, did you come to play with me? The sweet voice echoed in his mind again. Edward closed his eyes to calm down. Just then, a flickering image rushed into his mind. A man resembling a doctor was standing in front of a stretcher in the middle of a room filled with white furniture. He immediately opened his eyes. The patient lying on the stretcher was himself. But how? No, he whispered in a low voice. I was never here. The voice echoing from the walls answered, everyone was here. Some just didn't want to remember. Edward knelt down, his breath cut off. His camera slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. The lens broke, and the room was suddenly plunged into silence. The downpour had started again. Inside the building, there was no longer night or day. A kind of darkness, endless and beyond the reach of even flashlights, enveloped the hospital corridors. The stone walls of San Lazaro were breathing. They expanded and contracted like a deep lung, exhaling the past and the future in the same breath. Edward's footsteps echoed back, hitting 2 separate times with every step. In one, he was pacing the dusty corridors. In the other, he was stepping on clean, polished tiles. Minutes ago, he had lost consciousness. He had completely lost his balance as memories that were not his own filled his mind. Since his camera was also broken, he wouldn't be able to capture any footage. Wandering in this hospital was now completely meaningless. When he came to, the doll next to him was gone. Now, he was desperately wandering around to find the way back. Edward found himself at the intersection of a corridor that opened into 4 different paths. The paths were dark and too long to be distinguished from each other. He didn't know which way to go. The decision that would save his life depended entirely on chance. After a brief hesitation, he headed for the corridor on his left. He had barely taken a few steps when he heard tiny footsteps behind him. With the hope of finding some trace, he immediately turned back and this time turned into the corridor on the right. Following the sounds, he found himself in front of one of the treatment rooms. He read the plaque above the door. Resonance Therapy Unit. There was another note written in small letters below. Sound is the mirror of the mind. Edward shone his flashlight inside. Just then, the regular ticking sound of a distant metronome was heard from inside. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Edward reached for the door, but the door opened by itself without waiting for his touch. When he stepped inside, he wrapped his arms around himself. The coldness of the room had penetrated under his skin. An old tape recorder with huge reels was sitting on a metal table. Beside it were yellowed notes that were hard to read. Edward took the notes in his right hand and held the light over them. Experiment 47. High-frequency humming opened a passage to the patient's childhood memories. Time inconsistencies are increasing. Experiment 52. Memory does not sleep. Sound awakens it. The doctors are sleepless. Experiment 61. Some sounds do not pass outside the room. Some sounds are heard only by the room. While Edward was examining the notes, a thin whisper rose from the old speaker in the corner of the room. At first, he thought it was the sound of raindrops, but it quickly turned into familiar syllables. Ed. Ward. This time, it wasn't a child speaking his name. The voice was deeper and denser. It was too calm to be a patient's voice and too sorrowful to be a doctor's. Just then, the metronome beats sped up. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The faded paint on the walls seemed to extend to the ceiling in fine cracks, following the rhythm of the sound. It was as if the building was repeating Edward's name with every breath. Though startled, Edward didn't pull back. He continued to search the room and rummage through the drawers. He forced open one of the rotten locked drawers. An old diary belonging to head nurse El Montalvo came out of it. The smell of ether embedded in its pages was still vivid. The paper carried the fatigue of the years. Edward randomly opened a page and started reading. March 12th. The clocks in the resonance room are running backwards. Patients have started seeing themselves in their dreams. Dr. Salgado says the mind is an echo. If you scream, it returns. Although the children's ward was closed years ago, we heard a baby crying from the room last night. April 2nd. We tried locking the unit's outer door. In the morning, the lock was found torn out from the inside. The doorman said, "I didn't take it out." The fingerprints belonged to a child's hand. April 14th. A journalist came. No record, no appointment. He didn't show his ID. When I asked his name, he paused. It was as if he was choosing his name at that moment. "Edward," he said. Edward's fingers trembled. "This is ridiculous," he whispered. The date of the diary belonged to decades ago. Some pages were written before he was born. So, how could they know his name? At that moment, the metronome fell silent. The silence felt like an invisible pressure suddenly settling on Edward's eardrums. It was as if the air had consumed all the oxygen inside. Then, a muffled, gasping sound rose from the speakers. It was as if someone was speaking through a mask, fogging the air with every word. There are names that become real when spoken. Aren't you one of those names, Edward? Edward suddenly found himself in a different space. A new layer opened inside the room, pulling back an invisible curtain. The same resonance room from the past reappeared before him. The same table, the same notebook, the same speakers. But this time, a man in a white coat was standing in Edward's place. The man closed the notebook. Letters carved with a toothpick on the corner of the hard leather cover were visible. EJS. Edward leaned over the table. His eyes widened. The carving was his initials, Edward James Silva. He didn't voice his surname, because deep down, he felt that mentioning this name would awaken something terrifying. Fear taught humans the most primitive defenses, hiding one's name, holding one's breath, and taking small, silent steps. But in San Lazaro, every small step taken turned into a giant noise in another room. A patient list was found on the very back page of the notebook. 3 names were legible within the smudged lines. Maria del Sol. Past traumas triggered by resonance. Ignacio R. Shifts in the timeline, being present at his own funeral. E. Silva, unregistered, says he came from a different time, but he is already here. The last sentence was irregular, as if written with a sudden realization. He is already here. Edward staggered back. The metronome restarted, this time ticking in reverse. Tock, tick, tock, tick. It was as if time was flowing not towards the future as it should, but back into the past. Edward was about to put the notebook in his bag when the speaker opened by itself with a crackling sound. The voice coming from the recording spoke in a doctor's cold tone. Subject E. Silva claims to have come from outside with a journalist identity, gave his name as Edward in the first interview and Javier in the second, avoided saying his surname during the voice frequency test. When asked, he said, "If I say it, this place will remember." Claims he has never been to the hospital, but there is a recording where he overlaps with himself in the therapy room. The recording stopped. For a while, only the electrical buzz of the speaker was heard. Then a second voice, from a completely different time but on the same tape, intervened. "Edward, you are the sound that opens the doors." At that moment, the side of the wall rippled like a thin veil. The steel door in the corner of the room was dragged by an invisible hand. A narrow stairwell opened behind it. The steps wound down like a snake towards the lower floor. Edward raised his flashlight. His heart suddenly raced when he stepped on the first stair. It was as if pigeons fluttered in his chest. The light of the flashlight hit a Latin phrase carved into the stairwell wall. Audi et recordare. Listen and remember. When he went down, he encountered a damper floor. Water dripping from the ceilings flowed over the cables, forming small pools. Each pool reflected the ghostly flicker of the ceiling fluorescence, like a mirror. At the end of the corridor, there was a room surrounded by glass. A single word was written on its door. Echo camera. The door was ajar. Inside, a microphone was hanging from the ceiling. 4-way speakers surrounded it, and an adjustable high chair stood in the corner. Next to the door, the remnants of a broken plaque lay. The words on it were fragmented but still readable. "How many people are inside your mind?" Edward asked, reading the plaque. While he was examining the interior, the door locked behind him. Silence suddenly fell. It was a silence that had been previously measured, designed, and insidiously waiting. The red light on the microphone came on with an ear-splitting crackle. A plastic-wrapped tape hung from the ceiling void. The label on the tape read, "Record 61B, Reflection Experiment." Suddenly, his own voice was heard from the speakers, but he had never said this sentence before. "I am Edward. I came from outside. This is the first time I have entered here." Right after, the same voice continued in a different tone. "I am not Edward. I have always been here. I was just outside." And a third voice, almost as light as a breath, was added in a whisper. "Both are lies. The name is the missing key to the door, and you are the door." What he heard echoed in Edward's body as a sudden panic. His hands sweated, his knees trembled, and he couldn't stand upright. He sat down in the chair behind the table. The microphone swung like a pendulum towards his forehead and hung there. "What do you want?" Edward asked, feeling estranged from his own voice. The answer came from inside the walls. "To remember. Because if you don't remember, you can't get out. If you remember, you won't get out." A paradox. Edward smiled. He was completely unnerved. The human mind wants to escape its past, but it must also remember to reach the exit. And as it remembers, it gives up on getting out. Edward's pupils widened. The thought of escape settled over his head like a grey cloud. He definitely wouldn't be allowed to leave here. A crackling tune rose from the microphone again. It resembled a monotonous and hypnotic tribal melody from the rainforests. The tune mingled with the rhythm of the metronome. Then the rhythm swallowed the tune. Tock, tock, tock. With every beat, the shadows behind the glass began to move. Nurse Montalvo, Dr. Salgado, and a young man with a camera around his neck. Edward. But the shadows were not looking at him. They were all directed at another Edward sitting in the chair. The echo hitting the glass split his name into letters. EDWARD, with a strike of each letter on the glass. A new crack as thin as a strand of hair formed. Edward raised his hand and touched the glass. He felt a strange wetness along with the cold on his fingertip. A red and dense liquid resembling blood stained his hand. "Let go," the building said. "If you let go, 2 different Edwards remain. If you don't let go, they will all vanish until only one Edward remains, and the survivor might not be you." The microphone turned from a sharp whistle to a crackle. Then a heavy, echoing prayer was heard from the speakers. Latin, slow and determined. Memoria non dormit. Audi et recordare. Edward swallowed the lump in his throat and mumbled, "Memory does not sleep. Listen and remember." He had read these words on the hospital wall before, yes, but now he seemed to understand them for the first time. What he needed to remember was not what he had done in the past, but where he was. And each time, San Lazaro had sucked Edward in like a whirlpool. He slowly got up from the chair. The record button in front of the glass was flickering under the red light. With a sudden instinct, he pressed the button. At that moment, a scream erupted from the ceiling. The room temperature suddenly dropped by 5 degrees. The air coming out of the microphone cut Edward's lip, and behind these physical jolts, time flowed back into the past again. Montalvo took out her notebook from the pocket of her white coat and turned a page. "Today is A. Silva's last session," she said, but her lips didn't move. The words she spoke oozed from the edge of the notebook and mixed into the air. Dr. Salgado placed his hand on the back of Edward's neck, but didn't touch it. The weight of the hand changed the air pressure in the room, turning into a physical sensation on Edward's skin. And then the past Edward, standing with the camera around his neck, looked at the Edward in the chair. For the first time, they made eye contact. When they made eye contact, 2 different realities collided. The glass turned into a 2-dimensional lightning pattern, like a spider's web. The floor took a deep breath. "I am," said the one in the chair. "I am," said the one behind the glass, both at the same time. "We are 2 echoes of the same voice." When this sentence harmonized with the room's name, the lock turned. The door opened with a heavy click. White light seeping from the corridor divided the room in 2. Edward couldn't decide which version of himself was more real. As his head ached, the recording device stopped by itself. A newly added sentence on the tape was close to black. 61C. Reflection Experiment Union. When Edward stepped into the corridor, the metronome was ticking in its correct rhythm. A door that hadn't been there before appeared on the left of the corridor. The constant changing of paths had caused Edward to completely lose hope of escape. He knew he couldn't get out of here. All he wanted now was to solve the mystery he was in. He approached the suddenly appearing archive door. The door was wooden, and its handle was brass. When he turned the handle, the pieces inside the lock moved and shifted like insects, and the door hissed slightly as it opened. The inside of the archive smelled of mold. There were many books, files, and diaries inside. He approached the cabinet where dozens of files were arranged in alphabetical order. Edward pulled out the S drawer and opened the Silva E file. A small plastic card holder slipped out. It resembled an ID card worn like a lanyard. Examining the card, Edward realized it was his staff card. The title section was erased, but he could read the faint Latin letters from the engravings on the back. Resonantia Tech. Staff, Edward whispered, as if speaking out loud would make this nonsense make sense. But I was a patient, or a journalist, or ... quote. His sentence was incomplete, because footsteps belonging to a regular and patient person were heard behind the door. The crackle of the fluorescent light on the archive ceiling mingled with the approaching footsteps. Edward wanted to close the file, but the file didn't close. It was as if the papers were stuck to his hand. Meanwhile, the footsteps stopped in front of the door. The door opened by itself. The person who entered first filled the room with their shadow. Then the owner of the shadow stepped forward. The person who came was Dr. Salgado. His face was dotted as if dipped in ink. His eyes held a cunning but intense gaze. "E. Silva," the doctor said with a voice that filled his mind. "You chose to return." Edward was tense. When he came to this hospital, he only wanted to shoot a short film. I didn't choose. Not choosing is also a choice. The hospital does not like indecision. As the walls of the archive listened to this conversation, the metal covers of the drawers scraped against each other. The files slightly opened and closed by themselves, and the papers inside emitted a white glow. Salgado approached. He took the ID card from Edward's hand and turned it over. "You returned as a resonance technician," the doctor said. "Your journalist identity is a tale you made up. We love tales here, because a tale is the key to the door that opens to the truth." As the word key left his mouth, a door in another corner of the archive creaked. Dim white light seeped in. Salgado looked that way and slightly tilted his head. "We must go to the most fragile part of your memory, downstairs." Edward licked his lips as he asked, "Are we going even further down?" Yes, there was a further down. San Lazaro Hospital descended floor by floor like the underground veins of a deeply rooted tree. Each floor was like a half-finished sentence of a prayer or the unfinished scream of a patient's treatment. Dr. Salgado pushed the light-seeping door with his hand. The stepstones looked damp and slippery. There was a smell of sulfur mixed with iodine in the air. Edward realized that every step he took had already been taken by another self of his. Stepping on the same footprints again meant erasing the previous footprint, and every trace erased from his previous self reappeared, carved into the walls. Whoever speaks remembers. Whoever remembers is the one who remains, Edward said, reading the writings on the wall. When the steps ended, the darkness of a large room opened before them. The heat here was different. Although his body was warm, his internal organs felt frozen. A gigantic bell hanging from the ceiling stood in front of a massive mosaic embedded in the wall. In the center of the embroidered glass was a large eye, and in its iris were thousands of small, rotating clocks. "Where is this place?" Edward asked. "The decision room of San Lazaro," Salgado said. "Here, every sound returns to its essence. People call it judgment. We call it reflection." Salgado reached for the bell rope, and the bell rang for the first time. Bong! The sound was drawn into the mosaics. The room was trembling from top to bottom. The clocks in the eye turned towards Edward one by one. A feeling of sorrow surfaced along with old memories. Edward's mother was singing a song in a hospital corridor. He couldn't remember the words, but the melody was exactly like the one the doll had sung before. His mother's eyes were filled with the lines of time, just like the mosaic's eyes. "Enough," Edward said, his voice cracking. I don't want to see this." "Fear doesn't care whether you want to or not," Salgado said. "Fear chooses the wall it will tear down." The bell rang a second time. Bong! This time, the stones of the room briefly returned to the past. Edward saw himself in another corridor as he looked into the mosaic's eye. The walls were freshly painted. There was a smell of bleach on the floor. He was wearing a white coat, an ESILVA card around his neck. A young female patient was sitting across from him, her pupils trembling from crying. "Do you know what you are doing here?" the woman asked. Her voice was thin and fast, as if afraid of water. Edward said, "We are opening a channel to the past with sound. I close it again after the treatment." The woman smiled. That smile was as bitter as the last prayer of despair. But what if the channel opens to a different door? The woman's image began to fade. Just as Salgado was about to pull the rope a third time, Edward grabbed his wrist. "No," he said. "I remembered." "That's enough. There is no proof that you remembered." "Say your name," the doctor said. Edward paused. The words in his throat were like barbed wire. He knew what would happen if he said his name. And if he didn't, he would watch his old traumas again and again. The hospital had no mercy. He had to make a choice. He took a deep breath. "I am," he said, "Edward James Silva." All the clocks on the mosaic stopped at the same time. The bell didn't ring again, and the room found its own voice. Dust particles, like rain from the ceiling, fell and turned into words. "Welcome, staff." Salgado nodded. He smiled for the first time, but there was no human warmth in his smile. "Now you can open the doors. But know this, every door you open will demand that you close another one. You will choose whose door to close." Edward tucked the silver file into his bag as he stepped back into the corridor. As he moved away from the bell room, the regular ticking of the metronome began to be heard again. Neither was the building completely Edward's, nor was Edward the building's. They had a heart beating in common. As they turned the corner, an elevator door that hadn't been there before appeared on the wall. There was a single worn button on it. "-3, Edward said, looking at the doctor. Salgado confirmed, "Yes, we are going down." "What's there?" "There, you will decide whose door to close." The elevator door opened. It was filled with dense fog. Edward glanced back at the dark corridor. Everything he'd left behind had turned into shadows curling inward. He stepped into the fog-filled cabin. As the door closed, that familiar lullaby seeped from the speaker. It was the matured and deepened version of the child's melody he had heard on the first night. San Lazaro does not sleep. Whoever enters stays a while. The one who opens and closes doors eventually writes himself. The thin voice continued the song. The elevator descended like a long dream. The floor indicator lights had long since gone out. The metal cabin was now traveling not to the ground, but to the center of memory. Every second, it bumped into a different memory, shaking with the echo of the past. Edward knelt, clenching his fingers on his bag. As they descended, it became harder to breathe the heavy air, and the journey ended. The elevator opened with a spine-tingling, bone-grinding sound. Before him was neither a corridor nor a room, only a grey wall covered with cables twisting like veins the size of a rib cage. In the middle of the cables was a spherical cluster of white light pulsing like a heart. It looked like a heart, but more like a ball of light where thousands of voices beat together rather than a living organ. The heart of San Lazaro, said a voice, but this time it was not Salgado's voice. This was the hospital's own voice. The light around the heart spun in a circle around the vibration, emitting a whisper composed of prayers without the lips moving. And each whisper added a new rhythm to the heartbeat. Edward took a step. The floor sank where he trod, and his footprint closed immediately. Reality is melting here, he whispered. But even that whisper echoed as if it came from someone else's mouth. Suddenly his bag opened. The silver e-file inside flew out and remained suspended in the air. The pages began to turn by themselves. On each page was a different face, but the same eyes. Edward's eyes. In one, a patient. In one, a doctor. In one, a journalist. And in one, a child. Edward went back to the past again. Years ago, a baby was born in San Lazaro. His mother was a patient undergoing treatment. Her name was Maria del Sol. The doctors concealed the birth and kept the child as a project subject. That child's name was never written in any record. Only 3 letters carved on the edge of the experiment notebooks remained. E.S. Edward was shaken when he faced the truth. The veins on his forehead were prominent. Everything converged in his mind at that moment. His journalist identity, the past he didn't remember, the name in the notebooks. Edward James Silva was the hospital's own child. You created me, Edward said. We didn't create you, the building said. You used us to make your own voice heard. The shadows around the heart accelerated. Each shadow showed one of the possibilities Edward would live. Journalist Edward was thinking of an escape plan. Technician Edward was checking the systems. Patient Edward was carving Latin writings on the walls. They all shouted at the same time, "Which Edward is real?" The heart expanded with this cry. Cables extended to the ceilings and sparked. Edward closed his eyes, but the white light emitted by the heart passed through his eyelids. Edward realized the truth behind the resonance treatment applied to the mentally ill patients at San Lazaro, splitting and multiplying the patient's consciousness into different personalities. Madness diminished as it was divided. Thus, it was equally distributed to each consciousness. In each new consciousness, a decrease in the symptoms of the illness was observed. Edward knelt before the heart with the truths he realized. "Let me go," he said. "Let you go," the voice echoed. Letting go means silencing. Yet you came to record us with your camera. One of the cables extended like a snake and wrapped around Edward's throat. The metal was not hot, but he felt it pulsing like a vein on his neck. "What do you want?" "Complete the unfinished recording. Then you can leave." A small recording device appeared in the middle of the heart. There was a single red button on it. Edward reached out his finger, but the moment he pressed the button, all the shadows said the same word: remember. At that moment, all the images overlapped. The doctor's experiments, screaming patients, beds catching fire, and the electroshock buttons Edward had pressed with his own hand. Every time he came with a journalist identity, he was actually trying to document his own crime and failing. I am not a patient. No, the building said. You are the sick reflection of this mental hospital. The heart slowed down. The cables loosened. The light diminished. The building was no longer a fixed pile of stones. The walls were breathing. The windows were blinking. A sound rose from every room. A patient praying. A child crying. A man saying, I'm recording. And all the sounds finally merged into a single note. Edward's voice. Salgado's shadow appeared inside the wall. He was not a being with a body. The hospital had incorporated the doctor into its own consciousness. Everyone who remembers becomes one with the hospital, he said. Welcome, resonance. Edward looked at his hands. There were rusty cable marks on his fingertips. Every breath turned into the wall of a new room. A small microphone shone in a corner. Its red light flickered. A voice similar to his mother's whispered, Now you can go outside, but the outside is full of your voice. Edward raised his head. A thin elevator shaft extended upwards like light. His name echoed with every step he climbed. I am Edward James Silva. But as he went up, the words dissolved, and eventually only the sound of breathing remained. When the elevator door opened, it was day. The hospital, which hadn't seen the sun for years, was lit up. The storm had subsided, and the forest was silent. Edward stepped outside. When he looked back, San Lazaro was still there. Its walls were slowly becoming transparent. It was as if the forest was swallowing the hospital. He picked up his camera. The lens was broken, but the record light was still on. He aimed the camera at his face. This is the San Lazaro Institute. Every voice returns to its owner, he said. Then he smiled. Perhaps I am the one who remains now. The record light flickered for a moment, and a voice different from his own replied, We are here too. The camera dropped. The screen went black. The recording stopped with a click sound, but the rhythm of that familiar metronome could still be heard from the depths of the forest. Talk, talk, talk. He picked up the broken camera from the ground. The record light was somehow still on. A snowy image appeared on the screen. He saw many versions of his own face. Technician, child, patient. Each was Edward. They were just separated into different consciousnesses and identities. Edward knelt down. It's over now, he whispered, but his voice echoed even in his own ears. No voice ever disappears. A voice that materialized in his mind said, It is only transferred from one ear to another. The source of the voice was not visible, but it was coming from all directions, from under the ground, from the trunks of the trees, even from his own veins. Edward held his head in his hands. I don't want to listen anymore. At that moment, the world fell silent. The birds stopped, the wind ceased, the leaves froze. The silence, that vast, desolate void, permeated under the skin. Time paused for a moment. Edward pushed the limits of his consciousness, but realized there was no escape from the hospital. The hospital was still inside him, still breathing. Edward opened his eyes. San Lazaro was before him again. But this time, the building was complete. The walls were woven with light. The doors were in place. The windows were intact and shiny, as if it had never been abandoned. Time had returned, or perhaps he had bent time. A brass plaque shone at the entrance, San Lazaro Resonance Center. A small inscription below, Memory does not sleep. Edward stepped forward. The door opened by itself. The corridors were no longer dark. They were washed with a white, sterile light. There was a slight vibration in the walls, as if the building's breath could be felt in that light. A nurse smiled, holding out a file. "Welcome, Dr. Silva. You have your first therapy session today." For a moment, Edward's breath caught. Everything around him was alive. Doctors, nurses, patients, lights, sounds. None of them were ghosts. But Edward knew that this was only in appearance. The building had sent him back to his beginning. Or perhaps this was inside the aftermath. "What am I treating?" he asked. The nurse smiled, with a calm voice. "Yourself," she said. At that moment, all the clocks struck at the same time. The clocks on the walls, the vibrations of the ceramic tiles on the floor, the thin echo of the bells hanging from the ceiling. A single sound echoed through the corridors. "Start recording." Edward entered the therapy room. On the table was an old recording device with a red button on it. A notebook and a pen were waiting ready beside it. The door closed by itself, and with a click, the air in the room suddenly intensified. He sat down and pressed the red button with his finger. Subject E. Silva. Resonance therapy, first session. He wrote in the notebook with the pen. Every voice returns to its owner. The building was breathing again. But this time, it was not Edward's body, but his consciousness that was trapped inside. Time entered the loop once more. The beginning merged with the shadow of the end. Outside, the rain began, thin and continuous drops flowing over the forest and hitting the stone walls of the building. The camera was lying on the floor, having fallen from Edward's hand. The record light was still seeping from its broken lens. A foggy image appeared on the screen. A white wall, a chair, a table, and a shadow leaning in front of the microphone. The shadow moved slightly, as if it was about to speak, but would leave silence instead of words. Then it leaned in and whispered, "San Lazaro does not sleep." Edward took a deep breath. He heard his own voice. "My name is Edward James Silva." But the shadow, as if it was the reflection of his voice, replied in the silence, "And I am still inside." The recording stopped. The silence echoed like the last beat of a heart. But far away, in the depths of the forest, the rhythm of that familiar metronome could still be heard. Tock, tock, tock. Although his body was outside, Edward was still somehow integrated with the echo of San Lazaro. He closed his eyes. He was one with the breath of the building, and had become one of the thousands of echoes the hospital had swallowed.